Okay. Does it look fine? Good.
Looks good.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. So hi everyone. Again, my name is Alessa. And my project for my SOIS Capstone is actually pertaining to accessibility in pharmacy when it comes to deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So for my project, I wanted to specifically focus on this because before I entered the SOIS program, I was actually a sign language interpreting student. So I spent a lot of time within the deaf community. So I've gotten a lot of interaction with them and had a lot of different conversations about accessibility in Rochester, especially because Rochester does have the largest deaf population in the United States per capita. There is a 3.7% population of deaf and hard of hearing folks that live here compared to the national percentages of usually about 3.5%. Because of that, you would think that Rochester has a lot more resources that are a lot more focused on being accessible, but there are still a lot of places that are kind of lacking accessibility for deaf individuals. So my project, I just wanted to focus on making pharmacy a little bit more deaf friendly in terms of the services and the accommodations that are able to be had in pharmacy. So one of the reasons that I wanted to do this project, I work in pharmacy right now. I'm a pharmacy technician. I've started, once the pandemic started, I kind of like fell into this lane, but it's been very interesting for me. And I've been very interested to see the different things that have been happening. But one of the things that happens more than you think is a lot of medication errors and miscommunication with patients regarding how they're supposed to be taking their medications, any drug interactions, all that kind of stuff. And it just made me realize if that's happening between hearing folks and I speak English and you are also fluent in English and that's your first language and your only language, I could only imagine the kind of miscommunications and medication errors that would probably occur within deaf and hard of hearing folks, especially since that may not be their first language. So I just wanted to focus on thinking about how to make accommodations for the deaf community in these spaces. And it just leads to having a more equitable society for people that are not mainstream hearing folks that we're used to. And it's kind of a population that's kind of not really looked at when it comes to research about accessibility. We usually kind of think more towards like wheelchairs and that kind of thing when we think about making spaces accessible. So thinking about deaf people in this perspective kind of makes our society push forward in terms of being equal and being equitable for everyone in all facets. And then as well as wanting to prioritize the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was put into law just to make reasonable accommodations for anyone, all disabled folks. It doesn't have to just be deaf or hard of hearing, the whole array. And just making sure that in public spaces like pharmacies or places that people have to frequent in their life, that there are accommodations for everyone there. So for my project, I just wanted to offer some new strategies to pharmacists. So I've actually been directly talking to my pharmacist about and having this conversation with him since I've been working there about how to make the space more deaf friendly. And then the biggest place where we found like issues with being deaf accessible, where when it comes to medication consultations, as well as medication reviews and then vaccinations as well. It's been a new thing now that the COVID vaccine has been very popular. It's been a little bit of a struggle in terms of communicating effectively and answering the questions of people, because right now a lot of people have questions in general about the vaccines and about COVID and all these kinds of things, but it even makes it more like, it makes it even harder when there's a barrier for communication as well. So I've been talking to the pharmacy that I work with and discussing with pharmacy managers how to make the space more deaf friendly. So I did do research beforehand to see what kind of studies were out there regarding deaf and hard of hearing people in that community, as well as in relation to health literacy and things like that. So I found a lot of articles that did say that there's a lot of feelings of fear, mistrust, and like frustration when it comes to this community, just because when you're not able to just directly speak to someone, it kind of adds a layer of frustration. And then there are a lot of people who say that if they find a healthcare professional that does speak sign language, they will like never leave. Like that is their safe haven, because at this point, I feel like you can actually hear me as a person trying to get what I need across in order to have my health be a priority. And then there's a lot of research as well saying that there's low health literacy in the deaf community in general. I actually found a study that said that deaf people are 6.9 times more likely to have considered low health inadequate health literacy compared to hearing people. So 6 times more likely to have low health literacy. And then a lot of deaf people also said that they struggle with like written modes of communication because may not be their first language, and sign language does have a different grammar structure, different mode, a different way a way of expressing yourself. It's not as vocal, it's definitely more physical and visual. So the written communication mode that most people try to go for, that they think is kind of the middle point between being able to communicate with a hearing person who doesn't know sign language and in the deaf community. A lot of people go towards written communication modes when in actuality, a lot of deaf people are also not completely literate in English in terms of writing and reading as well. There were actually 2 studies that I did find that were connected directly to pharmacy and deaf people. And I found that there were 30% of pharmacists felt that they communicated effectively with deaf people. So that leaves about 70% that feel like their interactions with this community are not up to par where they feel like they should be in terms of how they are compared to other hearing individuals or people that speak English as their native language. And even for anyone who is fluent in English, medical terminology is pretty hard. And a lot of the things that we have to do in pharmacy, sometimes if you don't have the time to sit down with a patient, the easiest thing for you to do is to give them a handout. Here's all the frequently asked questions. Here's all the drug interactions with the medication that you're going to start soon. And all the things that you need to know about what to do and what not to do when you're starting a new drug or a new medication therapy. But those handouts are hard. They're hard to understand. There's a lot of big words. There are a lot of like not even the common person who knows English probably doesn't understand what you're talking about when you're letting them know that they're on an ACE inhibitor versus a beta blocker. They don't really know those kind of vocabulary, so it's already difficult to understand. And then with deaf people, even deaf people who graduate high school, 1 in 3 of them only have a 2nd to 4th grade reading level. So medical terminology is pretty hard to use or to see written and understand. So a lot of people also have tried different routes, as well as like using lip reading and things like that. But now that we're in a pandemic, that's even harder. Not people don't really use clear mask outside of RT and hospital spaces, things like that. And then a lot of pharmacists said that they would prefer if the deaf person came with a family member, so they would use that family member to interpret. But there's also some studies saying that that's not reliable because a family member can be biased. Maybe they don't want you to know something, or maybe they're trying to protect you in your best interest. So they're not giving full disclosure of what the pharmacist is trying to portray to the deaf person. So sometimes it's better to have a more neutral party. So that's kind of the findings that I found in regards to pharmacy in this community. So what I've been suggesting for my pharmacy in particular, for the integration of foundational American Sign Language. So just basic signs that have to do with medical terminologies, how to portray how a medication should be taken, how to properly do that in sign language, because we actually do get a course that's like basic foundational Spanish. So a lot of times we learn like how to explain things in Spanish because we have a lot of Spanish speaking customers or patients as well. So if we can do that with the Spanish community, I feel like that is something that we can integrate into with the deaf and hard of hearing communities as well. Just getting enough sign language so that you know how to have this conversation with a deaf individual that comes up to you. And then also the introduction of remote video interpreting. That's become very popular right now with the pandemic on the rise. A lot of people are moving towards telecommunications and using interpreters that are not on site. But with that, you also need proper training. Some people don't know that when you use these services that you should be speaking directly to the deaf person. You don't have to talk to an interpreter, just kind of like common knowledge things that makes it a little bit smoother for communication when you're using telecommunication services, because it's already kind of hard because it's 2D versus 3D and physical, and like viewing sign language visually on a 2D screen is also different than in person. So just learning how to navigate that and have that conversation so that people in the pharmacy know the difficulties or like what might occur using remote video interpreting. And then my last suggestion really was to make sure that all of the medication review sheets and all the common questions and FAQs that we have that are physically written have some version that are recorded as well. So even if we know that a patient is coming to get a controlled substance and we know that we have to give the medication review sheets as required by law, those should also be in sign language somewhere. Like if we had a platform of some sort where we could have that database where we could tell the patient, well, if you look on this website, it'll have an American Sign Language interpretation for all the risk and all the things that you need to know when you're taking your controlled substances. And that kind of makes it more accessible to that crowd as well. And then lastly was the screens and things in our waiting areas. For patients who sit down and like wait for us to have consultations or wait for us to let them know that their medications are ready, those kind of things. We usually just use English. We usually kind of shout across the corner like, oh, Miss Edwards, your stuff is ready, or so-and-so, your stuff is ready. So just maybe if we had like screens or televisions where we could like say, oh, this is ready for, and I understand like HIPAA laws and things like that. I've had that conversation with my boss as well. Can't really put the names out there. So even if we did like initials on the screen so that someone knows that it's their turn to come up or we're ready for them, that would be also pretty great or pretty accessible for this community. And then I thought about limitations as well. When it comes to ASL classes, I do believe that the person that does this should either be deaf or should be certified. We want to make sure that even when we're trying to give people access to American Sign Language, that we do so in the way that they're getting proper education so that they're not, so that they will also be able to be understood all the time. We want to make sure that the communication is clear. So learning from someone that's either certified or someone that is deaf themselves and has been using the language would be the best way to go about that. And then when it comes to using telecommunications and using video remote interpreting, making sure that there's high-speed internet connections. It might not be the case in all areas. So looking into ways that we could possibly get internet connection or some type of connection that would result in us being able to get sound video interpreting that won't fail on us as well. And then as far as those ASL interpretations for medical review sheets, we just wanted to see what kind of platform would we be able to put that on in terms of what a company would be able to sponsor, or should it be something public? A public platform should be available for people, and like how to navigate that realm as well, especially when you're in a pharmacy that's more retail pharmacy, which is kind of backed by a corporate. It's a little bit harder to get into access to these kind of things. So yes, that's what I've been looking for and what I've been working on this semester.
Thank you, Alessa. Meg, do you want to go first? Do you have any questions?
I do, actually. So I found that really interesting, Alessa, and I think that the added complication of COVID right now must have been really challenging. So I'm curious, how receptive? Well, first of all, it's fantastic that your interest allowed you a space where you could try some of these things out, or at least have some real-time conversations with someone that would potentially be implementing these recommendations. Not everyone has access to that kind of experimental, play space. So I think that's great. How receptive was the pharmacy to some of your recommendations? And I guess on top of that, I would add, is there an open source interpreting website where if I have very basic survival ASL. But is there a space where people could go to, I know how expensive interpreting is. I guess my question is, how do we get over that hurdle, and are there solutions? So it's a two-part question.
And that's kind of the conversation that I was having with my boss as well. He's receptive to it, but I work in retail pharmacy, so it's harder to implement like changes when you have kind of a corporate ladder that you have to go through to get things approved. So like my pharmacist himself was very open to the conversation, because we actually we're pretty close to RIT, so we actually do get a lot of deaf people that come through and need their medications and that kind of thing. So he was receptive to it, but it just seems like it's kind of we would have to go through loops in order for this to happen. And especially if it's going to be something that's special to our pharmacy, like the way that it kind of works with retail pharmacy is like, if one changes, we all have to change kind of thing. So he brought that to my attention as well. And right now, there's not any platform that I know of, because like you said, interpreting is expensive. But I do feel like there are ways that, so for example, like video phones and things like that, they're not necessarily free. But I do feel like personally, if we were going to make a move towards being more accessible, there is kind of like an investment. And I feel like that investment so if you have someone come in and interpret in person, it's actually going to be way more expensive than if we were to invest in, like, say, getting a video phone set up so that we'd be able to use that in a pharmacy. It would be a lot cheaper, because then it's kind of more of like a subscription versus like every time someone comes in, that costs $125 for 30 minutes. So something to that effect versus having people live interpret and coming in. It will still be an expense, but I feel like it would be less expensive, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. I thought that was really interesting.
Alessa, so I have a couple of questions. First of all, you said that 30% of, from your research articles, you said that 30% of pharmacies felt that their accessibility was okay to good, I guess. Do you know why they thought that? I mean, what about their pharmacies made them think that they were accessible?
It seemed like the trend that a lot of those pharmacists were felt that the written modes of communication were also adequate. So a lot of times it seemed like in that, especially because it was a survey, so it seemed as though those pharmacists that were replying yes, that they felt like they were communicating effectively, they used different modes. Like if someone had a question, they would just write back and forth to them, or that they would just give them the medical review sheet. And like if the person said, okay, that's good, then we're like A-okay. But you know, a lot of times patients say yes, like especially at retail pharmacy, they just want their medication, they're trying to get out of there. So a lot of people they're going to tell you yes, we're good, and just walk out anyway. So it's just kind of I don't know, it seems as though they were using that as an indication, but that also, I don't feel like that's a good indication of, yeah, I understand this medication. Because all the time I try to talk to patients and I'm like, yeah, do you know you can't do this, this, and this on this drug? And they're like, yeah. And then they call like a week later and they're like, oh, I have a rash. It's like, did you drink this? It's like, yeah. It's like, well, that's why I told you not to do that. So it's kind of like yeah, they used that the written modes of communication were good, but you know, you got to kind of take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, right. So I can quite see that. So probably right to be skeptical of those positive responses. So I take your point that if you're a part of a chain, or what you're calling retail pharmacies, I'm not quite sure but I assume that means like Wegmans or Walgreens or something like that. So if you're a manager of a pharmacy there, you probably are a little worried about how this is going to play out at the corporate level, and also that, you know, if I do it in this Walgreens, then you know, my colleague over there in that other Walgreens has to do the same thing. But I would think that from the consumer point of view, if you're deaf, just, you know, like we have churches that are, quote, deaf friendly, and churches that are not so that deaf people go to the churches that are deaf friendly. And I would think that would apply to pharmacies too, that if a deaf person found that, you know, this particular pharmacy I had a good feeling about it. I felt like I understood what was going on. That would then become a focal point for other deaf people because word spread. So that they would then tend to go to that particular branch or that particular pharmacy rather than any other. Is that probably what happens?
Yeah, that's what I would speculate would happen. It kind of makes sense. Like you said, it's the same thing with the churches, same things with doctors, anything like that. Like you find out a doctor knows ASL and everyone's like, well, I'm going to him. So
Right.
yeah, kind of the same thing.
Right. And I would think, and I think we talked about this when you were first pitching your project, that, with the deaf population being so large in Monroe County, that, pharmacies would be very interested in making themselves more accessible. So, it sounds like you didn't get the opportunity to go and talk to other pharmacies, but is this a project that you're going to pursue in going forward or no? I mean,
so yes, I'm not sure how per se, but I am looking to go to grad school and I do want to get my master's in public health, and it kind of is in the same realm. So it is something that I don't wish to, like, I don't want to just drop it. So it is something that I definitely want to keep going with. And I did propose it. But like I said, it's kind of been hard because it's kind of like corporate passes things around. It's like, oh, you shouldn't be talking to me. You should talk to so and so. It's like, okay, well, you actually shouldn't be talking to me. You should be talking to that department. So it's been like kind of a little process, but yeah, I'm not sure how far we'll get with how it's been going so far. But I don't plan on just dropping it. I do plan on studying more when I get to grad school.
One of the things we say to students in this course, people have all sorts of projects that they want to pursue, and they discover en route to trying to pursue them that there are problems and hurdles that they didn't expect, real life hurdles that
Yeah.
And that's part of that's you're learning that, so that's good, right? I mean, just because you didn't do exactly what you hoped to do and it didn't come out the way you hoped it would, you still learned a bunch of stuff. So that is really the purpose of the course. So it's good that you've become probably a little more sophisticated in your thinking about this problem, which I agree is a real problem. So anyway, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I hope that you can pursue it and that you can get some good results, because I think there's plenty of room for improvement there. And the fact that you understand that, first of all, anybody, deaf or hearing, just wants to get out of there, right? But if you're deaf, you have these extra issues, which are pretty serious, depending on what the medication is. So it really is something that it's really important work. So I hope you do pursue it. So thank you very much. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, I just had a comment, like that really spoke to me, just because I in my freshman year I was in Ellingson dorm and I didn't know any ASL whatsoever. So there was always this, well, there was literally a language barrier, and everyone just kind of kept to themselves because of it. It was, I think I missed out on a lot of connections because of that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alessa. That was great. And now,
Stephen, could I just make a quick comment?
Yeah,
would that be all right?
Please.
I'll make it very brief, but I just want to say, Alessa, I really like how you identified a community need and really put some creative energy in solutions, and really nice presentation. And I like that you're interested in pursuing an avenue of this in graduate school. And you presented some data and information out of some research journals, and I think you have a great opportunity to contribute to that body of research, and especially in the form of doing some kind of pre-post survey analysis, where you collect some data before implementing strategies, and then implement the strategies and collect more data, both from the pharmacy side and the consumer side. I mean, that could be the foundation of a graduate school project there. So I think you've got a great start.
Thank you. That was a good idea. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Alessa. And Richard, you're up.
All right. Let's figure out the screen sharing here. Share sound. All right. All set?
Yep.
Excellent. So I'm Richard. I'm a my disciplines are music and software engineering. So I'm here to talk about Melodious. It's a free and open source audio workstation. Our eventual goal with this project is to provide a free and open source alternative to the expensive suites of software that are currently gatekeeping the music industry. Music creators should be able to do everything they need in a single accessible workflow: composing, recording, mixing, live set list display, live looping, syncing multiple devices with their band members, sharing their music, video editing even. But without having to pay hundreds of dollars for expensive suites of software. Of course, that's a very tall order for one semester, so I decided to just get my feet wet by laying the foundation for just multi-track audio processing. So I had started this project planning to be a solo developer, but my friends were pretty interested when I pitched the idea to them. So a couple of them offered to join the project as designers, and 4 others are test users. So on the right, you'll see a screenshot of our task board. Since everyone works on the project at different times, this has been our primary method of communication, completely asynchronous. We post our ideas, resources, and progress for other members to view at their convenience. And whenever we get a chance, we work on the project in our own time, because we don't have an office that we all go to at the same time. So we have to figure out some way to coordinate. So since my core discipline has been software engineering for the majority of time I've been at RIT, I've decided to include our engineering process as part of this project. Our first step was to gauge the needs of our target users, which are musicians. I interviewed 4 people about their experience with music software, and I watched them use 2 of the most popular and most powerful applications on the market. This is Sibelius and Ableton. There are 2 different types of applications that in the near future we're looking to combine some of the core features of these. Actually, that was the original goal. However, when I started looking into the type of application on the right, Ableton, that's an audio workstation, it was like opening Pandora's box. Every time I found a feature, it was going to be like another month of work just to get something that I expected to do in a weekend. If I'm being honest, I definitely overestimated. And well, what we learned from the users using this is that most people, if they're even if they're experienced with other types of applications, like if somebody's used an audio workstation before and they open up Ableton for the first time, even if they'll usually know what they want to do, but they have no idea how to do it because the UI is just that cluttered. And only people who have been using the app for years are able to figure it out. So I handed off the feedback to my designers, and they decided to simplify. They wanted to keep the core features out front and still have the more powerful features, hidden behind clicks for people who need them. They felt that the traditional user interfaces were also a little dull, so they wanted to go with a little more of a bold color scheme. They took their favorite bits of different apps and combined them with a prototyping tool called Figma. This allowed us to present our users with interactive prototypes when we were still in the middle of designing things, before, so that the change in the design was like moving a text box or something like that. So this was the version after 2 rounds of feedback. This is most heavily influenced by Ableton Live on the right here. And since Ableton Live is a much more fully featured program than ours, at least at the moment, there are a few things pictured in here that won't be in the program for quite some time. Like, for example, that drop an instrument or sample here at the bottom. We don't have instruments or samples to drop, so it wouldn't make much sense to display that to the user. And all the stuff on the left too, where that's probably going to be the next thing we bring in, is all that menu on the left where you can bring in their plugins and stuff. All sorts of fun stuff. Users can add their own directories. It'll be fun. When it came to start coding, I wanted to give myself as much flexibility as possible while maintaining some sort of structure and some sort of order. I worked in 3-day iterations: 1 day of planning, 1 day of testing, and 1 day of coding. And yes, I test before I code. That's so that first of all, my tests aren't biased because I'm not expecting a certain result. I don't know how the code is written yet, so I don't know how to test it. I just know what what the result should be. And also, when I do start coding, I already have a clear metric for completion. I code until the tests pass. So the picture on the right is an example of the planning part of this. This is the only type of documentation that I could really include, just because the rest of it is just text documents. So this is a UML diagram. This is a visual representation of code. And I like making one of these before I start coding, because it's nice. It's kind of like the Figma prototype. You know, it's easier to just move one of those boxes or change change the way that arrow points or something, instead of actually doing that in code where, you know, you're just staring at a wall of text. So they're also very useful for communicating with other developers, which is great for the open source aspect, because since this is open source, we're hoping that, you know, if we get a user who also knows how to code, they might feel inspired to, you know, push a few commits and, you know, contribute to the project. And that's going to be a lot easier if we have this documentation ready for them. So I'm going to show you a video of me mixing a multi-track with the app as it existed this morning. I recorded this a few hours ago. You may hear some crackling because I was running a screen recorder at the same time, and that kind of fights with the live audio playback. And I also had to cut the video because the original session was like 15 minutes, and well, we don't have 15 minutes. So here we go.
me free. Do you remember the power in our hands, the fire in our veins, running together, and there will be no end to the spirit and the flame.
All right. Any questions?
Thanks, Richard. That was certainly different from a lot of the presentations that we hear. So let me make sure before I ask a question or two. So what you have made here, or are in the process of making, is an editor for some sort of musical substrate, right? I mean, what you were doing in what you just showed was manipulating all sorts of parameters related to the musical material that was sort of the input, right?
That's correct. That is correct.
Okay, so you started by showing us two applications on the market, and you said that they were, you know, from the user's point of view, they unless the user was very sophisticated, that you thought that they would be difficult to use and certainly to get the most out of, and that what you're trying to do is produce something similar to what they do, except in a more simplified and more user-friendly format, right?
Yes, that's one of our goals.
So I don't know, this is not my field, and I would have assumed that aren't there any copyright issues there when you say you want to use this aspect of this particular product and fold it into another aspect from another product so that becomes part of your product? Aren't the copyright issues there?
Oh, not at all. That's how trends are created. A lot of these features we're talking about are actually quite standard. It's just certain applications present them in a certain way that we like, and so we say, like, for example, like Ableton Live. If you hold on, let me go. Like how all the tracks are over here presented on the right, we want there to be as much information here. Eventually, again, this is feature dependent, but there's going to be as much information on these tracks as possible, at least accessible from the tracks as possible. Most applications, they force you to go into another view if you want to do most of this mixing stuff. We want it to be done as much on this little panel as possible, because right here it's very easy to see that this, you know, this is manipulating this audio, or at least I think it's easier to see than if you had like this but vertically stacked. You just had like you ever see those channel fader, those mixing boards they have in studios where they have a bunch of like this but vertical.
Yeah. Okay, so
little things like that like no one's copyrighted that, but that was inspired by another application.
I see. So it seems to me, as in any field, I guess, that what you're trying to do here is build a better mousetrap, to use
yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's a good way to put it.
But whoever made those two, whoever engineered those two existing apps, they must have been people like you. So why do you think, and this is just speculation, of course, why do you think they did it the way they did it, and you come along and you think that's too complicated? Why didn't they know it was too complicated?
Well, because for a lot of these applications, when they first started out, a lot of the features that they offer didn't exist. You know, at one point, their applications looked a lot like this because this is all people really needed. But over the years, Sibelius is a fantastic example of this. This guy over here. Like once upon a time, this was an extremely streamlined and elegant application, but now they tried to do this thing like Microsoft Word. You know how you have the ribbon up top, you have the different categories for different tools. They have one of those, but it's so poorly sorted that no one can use it. Everyone just uses the little search bar to find the command they want. No one actually uses the user interface. So what's the point? But at one point, it made sense because they had few enough features that it made sense to put them all there.
I see.
And so I guess I'm kind of taking a gamble that I think that a lot of these applications are kind of they're so packed full of features that the features start to overlap with each other, and I'd like to just combine them.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I would think that those guys, assuming that they are big corporations, they would want to hire you, but maybe that's a whole different field.
Maybe someday.
Okay.
I mean, how would that go in an interview? Hey, I'm starting a competitor. Like.
All right. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed that presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Meg now.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, Richard, I thought that was so interesting. I'll be honest, in a world of subscriptions right now, I feel like everything is subscription. I'm really interested in the fact that you want to make this open source, and I'm just curious about your process. You've got a team of 3 or 4 of you now. What's your process for taking this project? I'm guessing you're invested enough that you don't just want to drop it. So how do you plan on like recruiting others to pick up where you've left off or be additional teammates?
Well, a lot of that's going to come from my UX manager, actually, Danny. He is fantastic with open source stuff, and he's got a lot of connections. So I'm going to be handing a lot of that over to him. I'm going to try to focus as much as possible on the product itself, if that makes sense.
Okay.
But as far as our short-term plans, our GitHub presence is going to be important, and then we want to actually have a web presence because, like, the average user is not going to want to go to a GitHub and compile the code base themselves. I think most people just want an executable that they can run.
Okay.
So setting up a web presence is our first step there.
Okay. And I guess my other question is, who is the regular user? This isn't my background either. So I'm just curious, who's going to be checking this out? Like a complete novice, or that's somewhere in the middle, or like a musician that's, looking to really put together a single or something? I'm not sure.
So in the long term, we're looking to cast as wide a net as possible, but our first priority is people who are into music but haven't necessarily had experience with recording music or writing music. Musicians without a lot of experience with music software.
Okay. Okay, interesting. I guess I'll open it up. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I just want to say that that's really cool. Like, I do feel like, because you said that your target is basically people who want to get into music but don't have like as in-depth as experience in terms of mixing. I think you did pretty good in terms of making it like very simple and like very user-friendly. Because even when we were looking at the video of how you did it, it made me feel like, oh, it would be possible for me to make a song on this. Like, I'm not good at this. I don't know anything about music, but it seemed pretty like easy, pretty streamlined. So I think you did very well at executing that. Congrats, man.
I'll let the designers know.
Yeah.
Okay, both of you, Alessa and Richard, thoroughly enjoyed both of your presentations. And
David, did you want to jump in? I'm sorry, I wasn't sure. David turned his microphone off for a second.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I had similar questions to what you had, Meg. So many of my questions were answered. And Richard,
okay.
Great presentation. I come from a family of musicians, but I have no musical talent. And but So I still appreciate music, and I really appreciate the engineering that's gone into developing a product like this. And I like how you planned it out, and it really does look sharp, and it's intriguing that it's that you're pushing it into the open source market. But just a great job. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So wrapping up here, all you have to do now, as I tell all the presenters, is send us 2 papers, a product paper and a subjective paper, and then you're all done for the semester, at least as far as we're concerned. Maybe you have other courses too that you can have final exams for. So wish you lots of luck with wrapping the semester up. And once again, thank you very much for your presentations.
Thank you.
Great job,
Thank you.
Good luck with the
Great
rest
job.
of your semester. We're really proud of you. Hang in there. You're almost done. Take care.